I remember the chemical stench of the canal, where we boys washed our shirts. Corporate transporters sometimes passed through our slum, Arasaka selecting children, but only the clean ones. Arasaka gave me what no one else could. Values I could honor, live for. This was most important. You dirty your hands for money. I, in the name of principle.
So as you can probably see from two posters up there on my wall, I am a fan of the general cyberpunk genre, but like good fans, I feel like I can still criticize certain tropes in the genre and films I like and games I like when their origins are in a racist view of certain groups of people or cultures. So today we're going to be talking about the racism that is inherent in a lot of Western cyberpunk, and that includes things like Blade Runner, that includes things like Cyberpunk 2077, two things I really like. So what we're going to do in the video is go through the history of the genre, go through, you know, various tropes that you find, talk about the reasons why you have tropes, especially things about, you know, the fear of countries like Japan taking over the West and just Asian people in general, and then talk about how stuff that was conceived and created in the 1980s still has a through line to modern day cyberpunk. And I guess we're going to take a look a bit at Cyberpunk 2077 and the tabletop game that inspired it, which itself was inspired by things like Blade Runner. Before we go any further, edgier content on my channel is always demonetized, so if you want to support me monetarily, please check out my Patreon. Thanks so much to everyone who has already done this. At the moment, the benefits are gaining access to the private Discord server, and you'll obviously have your name featured at the end of every video and in the description. I'm working for some other benefits that will come in the future. If you want to join our growing community, please check out the Discord and the subreddit in the description. And if you want to follow me personally, check out @the Kavernacle on Instagram and Twitter. And also u/TommyCahill1995 for my personal Reddit. So with that out of the way, let's get into the video. Also, I'm trying to build my chocolate orange collection. So for every 5k, I buy another one. There's 4 there, nearly on 25. Let's hit 25 by the end of February so I can, you know, add another one to the pile. But let's get into the video. So just to describe my own personal experience of Cyberpunk, I'm not like a massive cyberpunk junkie in the sense that I'm consuming anything just because it's cyberpunk, although I am very attracted to the aesthetic, to the neon, to the rain, to these, you know, massive buildings and cities and everything. But I will say, Blade Runner, the first one, and especially 2049 are two of my favourite movies. I really, really liked Cyberpunk 2077. I only completed that last week. One of my favourite games in a while, and I just love the atmosphere, I love the environment. I also really like the Philip K. Dick books here. So I got the Blade Runner one, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and I got the Man in the High Castle one. I'm going to talk about how these factor in to Cyberpunk. Is it blasphemous to have covers of the movie and the TV show rather than the actual covers? So I am coming at this from the perspective of a fan because I do really like this stuff, but like I said, not the biggest cyberpunk junkie. I do give things a chance if sometimes they have that aesthetic, like, you know, Altered Carbon on Netflix, which was pretty decent for the first season. But again, I'm not so familiar with everything. So if you want to inform me on cyberpunk stuff I've never talked about, or stuff that you feel is very influential and I've, you know, had a big oversight on it, please let me know in the comments. So cyberpunk as a genre developed in the post-war era, and there's lots of works which deal with the themes of cyberpunk. Now, the themes of cyberpunk are pretty broad, and today I'm going to mainly focus on the cultural aspect of it. But of course, there's stuff like transhumanism, the way we interact with technology, you know, post-capitalist societies or hyper-capitalist societies, apocalyptic societies. All this stuff really factors in depending on what type of cyberpunk you are reading, and that stuff is always really fascinating to me. But what we're going to talk about today is that since the 1980s, since Blade Runner came out, there's been a strong infusion with Western cyberpunk and Asian culture, but it gets very problematic due to the fact that it is made by Westerners and it is really showing the fears of Westerners when they make this stuff. And cyberpunk stories are about dystopias, meaning you pretty much do not want to live in these places. And I think it's pretty telling that these dystopias depict certain cultures in Asia a certain way. If we look at something like Man in the High Castle, it is set also in California, and it's about a world in the 1960s where the Axis won World War II, and California is now controlled by Japan. Now, I like the TV show a lot, and I like this book a lot, but what it does do is show a society that Americans were fearing. If Japan came to America and imposed itself on the Americans, what would that look like? And I guess to a lot of Americans who read this, I'd be like, thank God we didn't lose the war and Japan didn't have the chance to do this. And then we have something like this. Really not a lot of Asian stuff in there so much. It's not really, you know, following this. Although some people do speculate both the book and the film take place in a world where the Axis did win the war. But I still don't think you can discount this book when you're thinking of Blade Runner and thinking of the world it depicts. You know, this very Asian, mainly Japanese inspired world. But yes, the original Blade Runner by Ridley Scott really did take this genre to a new level. It really helped people visualize what this stuff would look like, and the Asian stuff is so clear throughout the film. Even little things like Rick Deckard, played by Harrison Ford, eating ramen at the start, you know, and noodle stands and everything like that, instead of maybe eating a hamburger. And this seems to be the predominant form of, like, you know, takeaway in Los Angeles. And then you have lots of Asian people in the extras. You have a lot of people riding bikes in big crowds. You have a few Asian characters. I'm thinking of the guy who makes the eyes for the replicants. But then you have, you know, so many Asian people in this country. And I guess the dystopian part is that most people who are wealthy or don't have genetic disorders in the book and the film have moved off-world to other planets. But now here in America, which used to be, you know, a white-dominated country, now it has just been taken over by, I guess, not a very specific Asian aesthetic, but because that's what cyberpunk does. It mashes up these cultures into like an Orientalist blend, where you're taking, you know, Hong Kong, Japan, Singapore, and putting it into one thing. But it's also kind of saying like all the white people left and the Asians are here and willing to do, you know, the hard work. And that really harkens back to how a lot of Asian people helped construct the infrastructure of America. And if you know anything about, you know, like Chinese labourers, for example, that the British used or the Americans used, they were treated absolutely awfully. The Americans enacted various laws during the 1800s against Asian immigration. But like I said, despite the fact these workers played a very prominent role in constructing these things, and it's kind of like in the original Blade Runner, it's sort of, like I said, harkening back to that time where these Asian people would come over to America, do these awful jobs and get treated really badly. And then I guess above it all, in the original Blade Runner, you have the Tyrell Corporation in these massive pyramids. And I guess I don't actually have to deal with, you know, what the Blade Runner is showing is like a takeover of America by Asian culture. But America does have a certain view on Asian peoples because of its history with Asian people. So you have things like gunboat diplomacy in Japan. You have America having its own little enclaves in China in the 1800s. And then you have American foreign policy in general, where, you know, they would take colonies in Asia, like the Philippines, but they'd also like to play China and Japan off against each other. So when one country was weaker, they'd back that country against the others. So you had China before, so World War II, Chiang Kai-shek, heavily backed by the Americans in his fight against Japan. China, of course, becomes communist in 1949. America, after the war, throws its complete support behind Japan, and then they're playing those guys off against each other. And why America always do this is because it benefits them to split these two and help these two fight against each other rather than threaten America's interests. It's better for them to have a partner, and it's better for them for these two to be antagonistic against each other. But also, speaking of the war, it obviously informs a lot of American views on Japan specifically, because they had a brutal conflict in World War II against the Japanese. And obviously, some of the worst fighting in the whole war from an American perspective was in these islands, this island hopping campaign. And what probably annoyed a lot of Americans at the time is that Japan has seemingly never really apologized for the war, kept Emperor Hirohito in charge. Of course, the Americans wanted to rebuild Japan as a bulwark against communism in Asia. But you can imagine how this fueled this anti-Japanese sentiment. But also at the same time, you had a lot of American GIs being stationed in Japan. and a lot of them living there, sometimes taking Japanese wives or having children with Japanese people. And this cultural exchange, I guess, also helped influence a lot of cyberpunk. Because with the war and America's new relationship with Japan, this cultural exchange saw Japan become a lot more integrated into US lives. Now, this gets to why Japan has such a big influence in cyberpunk. It's because of American economic fears about Japan taking over the global economy. So the late 1970s and 80s is when Japan just dominate consumer electronics, consumer goods, the automobile industry, and you have, really cool things like the Sony Walkman.
That was no Russian imitation. It was the real deal. A prototype developed by a Japanese company.
Get out of here.
It's true. It had the Sony logo on it. The product name is Walkman.
Walkman.
It's a revolutionary new concept. Music you can listen to on the go. You can take it with you when you leave the house. I gave it a listen, and you wouldn't believe how good the sound quality is for something so tiny.
You have televisions from Sony. Of course, Japan at this time is really the only place making good video games, as opposed to America and all the stuff with E.T. There's a really good article that I read today, which I want to share for you, just to outline why Blade Runner is influenced by these fears of Japan taking over the global economy, which you can see visually in the film, and you can kind of see with some of its characters as well. So the Foundation for Economic Education, titled 80s Fears of Japanese Economic Pearl Harbor Look Silly Today, but They're Instructive, by John Phelan. So between 1963 and 1967, the Kennedy round of talks took place under the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, followed by the Tokyo round and the Uruguay round. Together, these reduced tariffs in all developed nations by about 1/3. Superior productivity gave Japanese producers an edge in these newly competitive markets. With automobiles, as economist David Flaff explains, process innovations that had been developed at Toyota in the 1950s and 1960s and then diffused to other Japanese companies had lowered the production costs of the Japanese auto manufacturers and boosted their exports. Then the rise in gasoline prices arising from two oil shocks switched demand away from the large American cars and towards the Japanese import. Between 1975 and 1982, when Blade Runner came out, Japanese manufacturers' share of total US new car sales rose from 9.4% to 22.6%, essentially more than doubling. So it goes on to say, then as now, the US found itself buying more stuff than it was selling to a particular trade partner, resulting in a trade deficit. This totaled $49 billion with Japan in 1989, which alarmed businessman Donald Trump. But the flip side of this was that the Japanese, like the Chinese now, were selling more stuff than they were buying from a particular trade partner, giving them a trade surplus. Where America piled up consumer goods, Japan piled up dollars. Surely the Americans are doing better out of this. What could Japan do with these dollars? They sent them home, using them to buy assets like the Mobile Building in New York in 1987, Firestone Tire and Rubber Company in 1988, and the Rockefeller Center in Midtown Manhattan in 1989. These dollar inflows showed up as a surplus on the US capital account, offsetting the ballyhoo deficit on the trade account. Then, as now, American producers began demanding and getting protection from Congress and the president. The American auto industry found eager defenders in both parties. During his 1980 presidential campaign, Ronald Reagan says, "Japan is part of the problem. This is where government can be legitimately involved. That is to convince the Japanese in one way or another that in their own interest, that deluge of cards must be slowed while our industry gets back on its feet." In 1981, Senators John Danforth and Lloyd Bentsen proposed a bill to establish import quotas for automobiles. The Japanese government acquiesced, agreeing to a system of voluntary export restraints. Initially sent to run until 1983, they were renewed annually until 1994. But there was a more hostile reaction to the Japanese, so in 1985, Senator Bentsen fretted, "We are in a trade war and we are losing it." In 1988, commentator Paul Harvey warned of an economic Pearl Harbor in an article called "Japan Buys US with Our Own Money." The military talk went beyond metaphor. The esteemed writer James Fallows wrote a series of articles in Japan in which he hinted at the darker side of the Japanese character by citing the violence in Japanese sex comics. These weren't fringe ideas. Of 1991's The Coming War of Japan, an actual war, not the trade war, Publishers Weekly wrote that while the authors sometimes overstate their thesis, their scenario is plausible. So the Japanese economy eventually collapsed in 1990. So you can see from that article that these were fears that went all the way up into the White House. And of course there was a nationalistic element that Japan's economy had rebounded after World War II, in part thanks to the US. The US had various protection treaties with Japan. The US has military bases all over Japan and stuff. So essentially it felt like to Americans that we are paying to secure Japan while it essentially robs us and hurts our own economy despite us being such a great friend to them. And like some neocons were speculating that there might be a real war with Japan because we can't keep letting them take over our economy. And this is the type of thinking that frames Cyberpunk, which frames things like the original Blade Runner, which frames things like a lot of Cyberpunk that was inspired afterwards. The Japanese were rising and there was a potential that they were going to become this economic superpower that the US couldn't contend with anymore, due to them flooding the market with their very well-made, I guess, consumer goods. So essentially a century of the American experience in Asia in general informed this stuff, but more specifically the 1980s with the rise of the Japanese economy and how powerful it was getting and how much it was hurting the US. And you'd think that all this time later, that these sort of tropes would maybe die out a little bit more. But I'm sad to report even something as new as Cyberpunk 2077, which came out in December 2020, does still have these tropes. Now, like The Witcher, CD Projekt Red has adapted something that already exists in popular fiction. It's a tabletop game. There's also some surrounding short stories and media around it as well. So it's been a very well-developed world already. So I guess it's kind of hard for them to stray away from the fiction. But Cyberpunk, the original, was in part inspired by Blade Runner, and you can see all of these things I spoke about. The history of the US and Asia, the history of US and Japan, really informs the world building of Cyberpunk. Now, in Cyberpunk, the game and the tabletop, the world is dominated by the Arasaka Corporation. In the game, you are driven to hate Arasaka because Johnny Silverhand, your best pal, really hates them for what they did to him. I'm not going to spoil that for you guys who haven't played it. But it's framed as this very, very evil and sinister corporation. And in a world of evil and sinister corporations that are dividing up America for themselves, these guys are the worst. But the history of their leader, Saburo Arasaka, really plays into a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about. You know, economic fears, general racism, and just viewing Japan in a certain way. So from the Cyberpunk fandom.com, I'm just going to read a bit of his biography. So, Saburo Arasaka was born in Japan in 1919, a family that could trace their lineage back to the noble samurai of old. His parents are rich and his father was a shrewd businessman and the Arasaka founder. He grew up in the Arasaka family estate located outside Tokyo, and he enlisted in the Navy in World War II. On August 15th, 1944, the day of the Japanese surrender, as the emperor addressed the people and made note of their surrender, Saburo was thunderstruck. He was on the verge of committing seppuku in his compound's cherry tree grove. Before the blade was able to puncture his stomach, he had a moment of epiphany, and it came with a vision. Right at that moment, Saburo saw the wisdom of his father's actions. The family's fortune would soon be his to control. He envisioned a Japan rising above the humiliation of losing the war and becoming an economic powerhouse. A Japan in a position of power from which it could dominate the world politically and economically. So I like this quote from him, and I think it sums up a lot of the problems with Cyberpunk. So he says, "I hate America. I will bring them to their knees by supplying them with everything they want, and then strangling them with their own dependency. I will sell them the chain in which they will bind themselves to me." Kind of sounds like Stalin a bit there. But essentially what he's saying is not too different from some of the titles of the articles I read out, that it's basically destroying the US with the US's own money because it's selling America all these goods. But I think it just shows the through line from the politics of the 1980s with Japan and contemporary cyberpunk. Now, Saburo is not a sympathetic character. While there are some options and some paths you can take in the game where you're more closely aligned with his family and help his family out, it's pretty clear these guys are the bad guys. And it's pretty stereotypical that the guy who's in charge of his corporation that runs the world is a guy who fought in the Japanese military during World War II, very, very nationalist about Japan, a problem they still have with some elements today, wants to hurt America, and is doing it in a very stereotypical way that a lot of Americans imagined many Japanese businessmen were doing in the 1980s. So just like general cyberpunk, the problem is that for some reason, specifically Japanese corporations or companies are sinister. And in the Americans' views, they're mostly tied up with far-right Japanese politics, about nationalism, about getting one over on the Americans. And I'm sure that might have existed at some companies, at some levels of, the companies who maybe helped the Japanese war effort in World War II. But again, these companies kind of just want to make money. America's a very close trading partner, especially in the aftermath of World War II. Very, very easy to do business with a country you're so closely allied with. So it's kind of like a stereotype for all these companies to be scheming to undermine the US through the economy, rather than them just going through a particularly good period in the 1980s, which led to a crash in the end. So the real wars that some neocons imagined, or the economic trade wars that would go on for decades, never actually came to be. Now, that's the economic side. I think we should touch on maybe the general cultural stuff. So Orientalism was, of course, a book wrote by Edward Said. If you're a basic bitch poli-sci major, I did it for my masters, I did international relations, you will have read this guy. You probably would have read Orientalism. Now, for me personally, probably one of my favourite parts is like the power and knowledge stuff, because I think it explains a lot. I don't think it's as relevant here. It's still relevant, but not as relevant, because, culturally, Japan is a powerhouse. Not on level with like the UK or the US, but very, very popular these days. So I don't think it's the sense that if I say something about Japan, as, in Western media, that they can't counter that, or I can't find a Japanese counter to that. Like, for example, if I made a film about Iraq or Iran or Afghanistan, where they don't have, the cultural or financial power to counter these narratives I'm pushing. But I guess the problem with Orientalism is the problem dating back to the colonial period of the Orient. Now, the Orient was just a name for, I guess, Eastern colonies, but it would basically combine all these groups into one easily understandable stereotype. If you read stuff in Edward Said's book, he talks about the various British colonialists who would write about Egypt, saying you couldn't trust the Egyptians, extremely lazy, couldn't get an honest day's work out of them ever. And because of the power and knowledge things, most people in Britain thought Egyptians were like that. But the problem with cyberpunk genre in general is that we are quite ignorant of the cultural differences of Asian countries. While most people in America could probably maybe tell you the difference between like a Scottish accent or Australian accent or a British accent, even though we all look pretty similar, they couldn't tell you the differences between Koreans, Japanese, Chinese people, Taiwanese, maybe even like Thai people, Vietnamese and stuff like that. Now, in this sort of colonialist mindset, it sort of all blends into one. While Blade Runner will take examples from like Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan and other places like Thailand and Vietnam, we won't make the distinction. And I guess in things like Cyberpunk 2077, it just kind of blends into Asian. It's just Asian. We can't really tell what it is. You have things like the tiger claws, and you have some advertisements that are dystopian, and I think they're meant to be pretty racist, but we don't really understand what it's trying to show us. And even though there's things like Chinatown and Japantown, in the case of Cyberpunk 2077, sort of all blends together, and there's not really much nuance there. Of course, these cultures all have their own nuances and differences, and it'd be nice to explore them, because Western media takes great pains to explore the differences, even between two countries that exist right next to each other. Like, imagine watching Braveheart and the English and the Scottish were exactly the same. But that's exactly what we get with a lot of cyberpunk and Western depictions of Asia, and that is how it kind of plays into Orientalism. We see it as the Orient still. It's all just one big thing, and all these stereotypes about one country or the other will just apply en masse to all of them. And because America primarily dominates culture, and it's recently had a pretty bad history of Asia, so you think about World War II, then you think about the Korean War, then you think about Vietnam, and you have these very, very hostile experiences with Asian people. And then you have a film industry, which is very much in bed with the Department of Defense and everything like that, and especially during the time of fears about communism, where more stuff was censored and manufactured in a certain way. It leads to people putting these countries into a very neat, understandable package, just like the English used to do with people like Egyptians back in the day. So essentially all these cultures, peoples and languages are just blended together for the aesthetic, really. And although I don't think everyone who uses this aesthetic is racist or insensitive and stuff, it's clear that the origins of the aesthetic are in racism. Now, cyberpunk as a genre isn't cancelled. I don't know if you'll ever be able to do it without the Asian aesthetic, which is problematic, but I will say the contrast between the two Blade Runner films, I think, shows us that some people are willing to move away a bit from these caricatures of Asian people. So I've been watching Blade Runner 2049 a bit lately. A bit, as you know, it's one film, I've been watching it multiple times. Now, I'd say the biggest contrast in multiple ways between these films is they both reflect fears of the time. So the first Blade Runner reflects the Western fears of a Japanese takeover, with an undercurrent of the racist view that Americans often have of Asian people in general, and how they often view them as this disposable, I guess, horde that is just used to construct stuff across America to help them, but they're treated awfully. Whereas Blade Runner 2049 is more about our fears of things like climate change, for example, and things of this hyper-capitalist society where all nature is destroyed. But if you think about the aesthetics of that film, sure, you do have the Asian aesthetic. You do have companies like Sony popping up everywhere. You do have some Japanese lettering on things like billboards. You do have some, I guess, Japanese-style animations on advertisements. You do have Ryan Gosling's Officer K eating rice and sushi, although I wouldn't really say that's inspired by racism at this point, because that's pretty common in Western countries to eat Japanese cuisine. A lot more common than it was back in the 1980s. But I feel like this film does it a lot better. You have like Indonesian writing on the wall. I think he talks to someone as well at one point who's speaking an Asian language. It might be Indonesian as well. And it's just more of like a dark, hyper-capitalist society, and it's a dystopia, and it's very, very bleak. But the neonness and the Asianness, I think, has taken a back seat in this version. And I don't know if that's a conscious choice, but I think it shows that this genre does have a future where the, you know, Asian stereotypes, the Orientalism takes a back seat, but can still be part of the aesthetic. But you don't have to have people like Saburo Arasaka being an extremely stereotypical villain in Cyberpunk 2077. You don't have to have a society in America that is completely taken over by Japan and Asian cultures. You don't have to have that in, I guess, the new age of Cyberpunk. But I think Cyberpunk 2077, although these guys probably do love things like Blade Runner, and they do because there's loads of references to both films in the game, it's clear maybe they're too inspired by 1980s Cyberpunk. So it'd be interesting to see how Western Cyberpunk evolves moving forward. Of course, I didn't talk in this video about actual Asian Cyberpunk, like Korean Cyberpunk or Japanese Cyberpunk. And it's interesting, especially when their Cyberpunk is explicitly inspired by things like Blade Runner. It's like they're taking back the stereotypical depictions and making it their own, which I think is really interesting. But I didn't really touch on that because I didn't know much about it. But to conclude, Cyberpunk is a pretty complex genre. It spans so much different things, but it has its roots in things like Philip K. Dick and Man in the High Castle and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. Of course, Blade Runner, the film, really brought it to the mainstream, but of course has a lot of racial stereotypes in it, a lot of economic fears about the time, which many people, even Ronald Reagan, were talking about, and this stuff translates to Cyberpunk today. So anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Thanks for sticking with this one. If you want to follow me on social media, at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram, come and check out my Patreon as well. This will be demonetized, as most of my videos are. If you want to join our communities, subreddit and Discord in the description. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.